Hey guys, today we're going to be doing chapter 2 of The Secret City and do a quick recap of chapter 1. We met the main character whose name is George. George lives in a 300-year-old house that was originally built by a pirate. He just had his birthday party. He's got his best friend Derek at the party. And there's a girl I think he kind of likes. Her name is Shannon. She's at the party. She was in a band that played a song or two. Excuse me. And as the party was winding down, they got to talking about George's house being an ancient pirate house and or 300-year-old pirate house. And they decided they're going to go up in the attic and see what they'll find because the house has been in George's family for 300 years and they think that they're going to find all kinds of pirate things in the attic. And the cool thing is they are going to find some things. Chapter 2 is called Operation Attic. Let's do it. Shannon sprang to her feet, and Derek lifted a little more slowly, having noticed George's apprehensive expression. The three of them went inside and up to the stairs. The moment George put his foot on the first step, the doorbell rang. George jumped instantly, thinking his father had found him out, but his father wouldn't be ringing the doorbell to his own house. George crossed the excuse me. George crossed to the door and stood on tiptoe to look through the peephole. Happy birthday, George! George opened the door. It was Mr. Roulon, who lived at a big loft a few doors down. Mr. Roulon was one of those few adults George called a friend. He was the sort of guy who could talk to anyone, and George's father had been friends with him for years. He always sounded sleepy, as if he had stayed up all night. I'm sorry I couldn't come to your party, Mr. Roulon said, but I did bring you a present. And that's the most important thing, right? Everybody wants those presents. Oh, thanks, George said. He took the little package and opened it. Wow, it was a watch. It glowed bright blue when George pressed the button on the side. It looked like the kind you could wear when you were diving to the bottom of the ocean. It had a stopwatch, an alarm, and best of all, a built-in compass. They're going to need that compass in a few chapters. They're going to use that compass. Now you'll never get lost, huh, George? Thanks, Mr. Roulon. You're the best, George said. He strapped on the watch. It was one of the coolest presents he had gotten. Well, I have to go. I've got ice hockey tickets, but happy birthday again. Tell your father I said hi. The moment George closed the door, Shannon bounded up the stairs. Come on, she said impatiently. George sighed and followed. They reached the second floor where George's room was. Only his father's room and the attic were above. Once they were past this point, they wouldn't have an excuse for being up there, and if his father had come back while they were in the attic, there'd be no way to sneak down. George's house wasn't made for sneaking. The wooden floors all had creaky spots, and the old windows moaned when it was windy. The whole house would rattle as subway trains passed underneath. When George was little, he believed monsters lived in the basement, which was always damp and cold. Sounds a little bit like my house since I live right next to some train tracks. Almost right next. I live about 100 yards from train tracks, and all of that sounds like my house too because my house is old. Anyway, just a little connection there. The rumble of the subway trains and the hiss of the steam pipes. We don't have steam pipes in my house, though. The hiss of the steam pipes had turned into dragons and snakes in his dreams, but that was a long time ago. George started up the narrow stairs to the third floor. The faded wallpaper was here, and it marked with a few bright rectangles outlining where pictures once hung. After his wife had died, Peter Van Gelder had taken down all the pictures of hers and the one of him and the family. The rest of the house hadn't changed much in the last 6 years, but up here near his father's bedroom, it had become bare and lifeless, except for the ever-growing stacks of books. And if you don't remember, George's dad is a history professor. He does a lot of reading. Once they reached the top, George pointed silently at the ceiling where the door to the attic was visible. It was a trapdoor which swung down on hinges from the ceiling. Move over, said Shannon. She jumped up and grabbed the cord that dangled from the door. The door folded down with a low creak of springs and the stairs, dropping the stairs to the floor as if from the underside of a flying saucer. Cool, she said, grinning. She climbed up the stairs and pushed open the door. Derek and George looked at each other. Derek's expression said it all. He didn't like getting into trouble, even with somebody else's dad. George should have known Derek would wimp out. He always did at the last minute. Oddly enough, now that George was this close, his nerves seemed to subside, and he was in the mood for a practical joke. "Where do you think you're going?" George said, imitating his dad's authoritative voice. "Don't do that," Shannon snapped after she realized it had been George. "It gives me the creeps." "She's right, George," Derek said. "It isn't normal." "It isn't normal," George muttered in Derek's dad's voice perfectly. Imitating the others' voices was only one of his special talents. His only special talent, really. "That's really a really bad habit," Derek said. "That's a really bad—" "Shh," whispered Shannon as she disappeared into the attic. George swallowed a laugh and looked up at the stairs. His anticipation was growing. What if there really was some big secret up there? What if his father had discovered Captain Kidd's old papers? Maybe they'd been in the family for centuries. After all, it'd be logical for Captain Kidd to hide that stuff here. He lived in this house until he was sent to England to be hanged. Maybe his father was hiding something, and that was why George wasn't allowed in the attic. Come on, his father? Who's he kidding? George took a deep breath and climbed the stairs almost to the top and then looked around. Shafts of sunlight. Excuse me, guys, I got a lot of sinus drainage today. Shafts of sunlight streamed through the dirty skylight. The dark cherry colored wood of the floor reflected the sun, making the whole room glow with red light. Pushed against the walls were pieces of furniture, desks, a couple of heavy chests, a stack of sweaters, and an embroidered pillow. All of these things brought images of his mom flashing through his mind. George stepped to the stairs, from the stairs, and Derek scrambled up behind him. "Should I fold up the stairs behind us?" Derek asked. Both Shannon and Derek were looking at George like he was in charge now, as if this had been his idea. "No, no, keep the door open. I want to hear when my dad comes back." "Wow, this furniture looks old. It must be original stuff," Shannon said. "Might be." George reached out his hand to touch the desk in front of him. If Shannon was right, it was more than 300 years old. He put his palm against the sun warmed wood. Somehow the desk felt right, like it really belonged here in the house. Like it had been here before, always been here. Lying on it was a map. Not a treasure map, but an ordinary one with countries. George recognized it was the countries in Eastern Europe, the nations his dad had wrote about all those papers about. But a shiver ran up George's spine when his fingers touched the date on the map, 1697. That's weird. The map was almost from the same year when the house had been built, but so much changed since then. "Don't leave fingerprints," whispered Derek. "What are you talking about? My dad's a history professor, not a detective." "Still, we should be careful." "You watch too many cop shows," Shannon said. On the back of the desk was a rack of small square holes, pigeonholes. George remembered that's what they were called. Each one had a scroll of paper resting in it. "Nice," Derek said. "Maybe they're treasure maps." George pulled the scroll out carefully. He unrolled it, flinching when a tiny piece of paper crumbled from one corner. His stuff was really fragile. Maybe his dad was right. He shouldn't be up here. But he kept unrolling the paper anyway. It was written in a fancy cursive, the ink blotchy and faded. He struggled to make out the words in the unfamiliar script. "Two boars, one hogshead of wheat, two flagons of ale." "It sure is hard to read," Derek grumbled. "Let's see," George went on. "It sounds like a—" George couldn't bring himself to finish. "Nice work, Sherlock. I believe you discovered a shopping list." He put his hands over his mouth and snickered. "A shopping list?" Shannon asked. George dropped the document onto the desk. He knew that he was what was probably up here. Boring stuff. Dad stuff. But it was a letdown to find out it was true. "Look at this," Shannon said. She was pointing at a painting high on the wall. A dark, somber portrait of a woman. She looked about 30 years old. George's jaw dropped. "That's my mother," he said, astonished. "George, that painting's way too old to be your mom. But it looks so much like her." George's hand immediately reached for his pocket. Before she had died, his mother had given him a locket. It was the kind of a girly thing, the heart-shaped kind that he kept in his pocket instead of wearing it. He'd never even shown it to Derek, but he always wanted it with him because it had her picture cut into the ivory inside. At least he'd always thought it was his mother's picture. He pulled the locket out and opened it. The face, the hair, the pose were all the same as the woman in the painting. The locket must be a lot older than he thought. "Of course," George said as it hit him. "It's Sarah Ort." Derek looked over his shoulder at the locket. George turned it to the back of his pocket hurriedly. Your great, great, great. Yes, George said. My great times eight grandmother, the wife of Captain Kidd. The resemblance was so strong the picture could easily have been his mother, only with slightly darker hair. His father never wanted pictures of his wife around, but the portrait looked so much like her. George wondered why his dad hadn't taken this one down. Look at the size of that diamond in her necklace, Shannon said, whistling. Resting on the throat of the woman in the painting was a huge diamond. Whoa, George whispered, taking a step back. George, Derek said, watch out, you're. George felt himself bump into the desk behind him. He saw the eyes of the other two widen as he tried to brace himself. The shelf of pigeonholes toppled forward and crashed into him from behind, knocking him down to the floor. He was dazed for a second, staring at the ground, the weight of the rack cutting his shoulder. George, are you okay? Shannon asked, sounding more worried. Yeah, I think so. His shoulder hurt, but that was it. Get this thing off of me. Shannon and Derek lifted the grid off from him. George stood shakily. He didn't feel like anything was broken, but he'd be sore tomorrow. Then he saw the paper on the floor. It looked like a handful of dusty confetti. Uh-oh. Little pieces had crumbled from the ancient documents when the shelf fell. Ancient bits covered the floor where the paper looked like paper snow. George looked at the desk. The scrolls were still there, nestled in the pigeonholes. They hadn't completely disintegrated, but about 1,000,000 little bits had fallen from them. We got to get this cleaned up, Derek hissed, kneeling down to scoop up the confetti. Your dad's going to kill us. George knelt beside him and brushed the bits of paper into a pile. Give us a hand, Shannon. Shannon? Derek asked. What's wrong? She was staring at the desk. A piece of wood had broken off the top. Great. How did I break that? George said. He felt sick. This was major trouble. You didn't break it, Shannon answered. She turned to George. Her eyes were round with amazement. But I think you found treasure map. So there's a secret compartment in the furniture that he just broke, and he does indeed find a treasure map. If I can get this in the right spot for the camera to see it all, there's our treasure map. It's got on the side it says the key to good fortune lies in the heart. And then we've got some other information. And when I do tomorrow's chapter, this will be on the screen so you guys can look at it in a lot better detail. So that's the end of chapter 2 of Pirates, the Secret City by Chris Archer. Hope you enjoy it, and we will continue the adventure tomorrow.